The divorce papers were signed in a hospital corridor, still smelling of antiseptic and blood. Lena Parker lay unconscious behind double doors, her body stitched up after an emergency C-section that had saved 3 premature babies. Machines whirred, red lights flashed. Somewhere inside, a nurse whispered prayers. Outside, Gus Harrison adjusted his tailored suit, picked up the pen, and signed his name without a flicker. 10 minutes earlier, Lena had almost died. Gus didn't ask if his babies were breathing on their own, didn't ask if his wife would wake up. He had just one question for his lawyer. How quickly can this be wrapped up? The answer was simple, immediate, clean, quiet, exactly how he liked it. A doctor emerged, exhaustion etched onto her face. "Your wife's in critical condition," she said. "She needs, I'm not her husband anymore." Gus cut in, closing his briefcase. His voice was calm, almost bored. "Notify her family. She doesn't have family on her side," the doctor replied. Gus paused for half a second, then nodded, as if that resolved everything. He turned and walked away, his leather shoes echoing down the corridor, past framed photos of smiling newborns and hopeful parents. Behind him, 3 babies fought for breath in clear plastic incubators. By morning, Lena would wake up divorced, without health insurance, and legally, with no power over her own children. Gus, meanwhile, headed down to the underground car park where his black Mercedes idled, engine running. He checked his phone. A message from Bridget Newell lit up the screen. "Done?" He replied with one word, "Yes." As the car pulled into Sydney traffic, Gus allowed himself a smile. The timing was perfect. No messy custody battles, no fragile wife slowing him down. In 6 weeks, his company would enter its most crucial investment round. Investors wanted strength, not sentiment. A man who cut ties cleanly. Upstairs in the NICU, a nurse gently pressed Lena's trembling hand against the incubator glass. The babies were alive, but barely. Lena's lips moved as if trying to apologize to them for something she didn't yet understand. What no one in that corridor knew, not the doctors, not the lawyers, not even Gus himself, was that the moment he signed those papers, he triggered a chain of consequences that would unravel everything he thought he owned. And the woman he'd just erased was about to become the most dangerous mistake of his life. Lena Parker woke to the sound of an alarm she didn't recognize, and a wrongness in her body, like something had been taken and not returned. Her throat was parched, her head throbbed. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was, or why her legs wouldn't move. Then the pain returned. She tried to sit up, but a sharp agony tore through her abdomen, wrenching a groan from her lips. A nurse rushed to her side, gently pressing a hand to her shoulder. "Easy there," the woman said softly. "You've been through a lot." "My babies," Lena whispered, her voice raw, raspy from the breathing tube that had been removed hours earlier. "Where are my babies?" The nurse hesitated. "They're in the NICU, love," she said. "They're alive, fighting, very tiny, but stable for now." Relief flooded Lena so quickly it made her dizzy. Tears slipped down the sides of her face, soaking into the pillow. "Can I see them?" The nurse looked away. "There are a few things we need to sort out first." A man Lena had never seen before walked into the room, holding a tablet instead of flowers. He wore a hospital ID that didn't mark him as medical staff. "Mrs. Parker," he said, then corrected himself without apology. "Miss Parker, you're 420. The words landed with more force than the surgery. "There's been a change in your marital status," he continued, his voice flat and professional. "Your divorce was finalized early this morning." Lena stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "That's not possible," she said. "I was unconscious." "Yes," he replied, "but the paperwork was valid." Her heart began to race. Gus wouldn't do this. "He already has." The man tapped the screen and turned it towards her. Gus's signature stared back at her, strikingly familiar. Her own name appeared below it, printed, authorized, executed. The date, the time, all precise, all definitive. "Mr. Harrison terminated your health cover," he continued. "Hospital administration has reallocated your room. Medical decisions regarding your children are currently under review, pending clarity on custody." Lena's fingers curled into the sheets. "They're my children. That's being determined," he said. The room began to spin. "Where is he?" she demanded. "I want to see my husband." The man met her eyes for the first time. "Mr. Harrison has declined any further involvement." After he left, the nurse returned with a wheelchair instead of comfort. Lena was moved to a smaller room on a different floor. No windows, no monitors, no coziness. She was given a thin blanket and a clipboard of forms she could barely read through her tears. Hours later, she was wheeled past the NICU. She saw them through the glass, 3 tiny bodies tangled in wires and plastic, fighting battles she couldn't fight for them. She reached out, but the chair kept moving. It was then Lena finally understood the truth. She hadn't just been divorced, she'd been erased. And as she lay alone that night, clutching the hospital band Gus had paid to have removed, a soft knock came at her door, one that would change everything she believed about how truly alone she was. Gus Harrison stood before the mirror in his Sydney CBD penthouse, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored shirt as sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Sydney sprawled beneath him, sharp and compliant, exactly how he liked it. Everything was quiet, controlled, clean, precisely as he'd planned. His phone vibrated on the marble benchtop, a calendar alert. Investor coffee, 9 a.m. He took a sip of black coffee, scrolling through the night's messages. Congratulatory notes, a few cautious inquiries, no pushback, no negative reactions. The divorce had gone through exactly as his lawyer had promised. Efficient. He hadn't slept much, but it didn't matter. He felt lighter than he had in months. No more hospital visits, no more emotional landmines, no more explanations. Lena had become a liability the moment the pregnancy complicated. 3 premature babies weren't a blessing in his world, they were a risk, and risk was something Gus Harrison eliminated. Early, he picked up his phone and dialed a number he'd memorized long before the ink on the divorce papers had dried. "It's done," he said when Bridget answered. She chuckled softly on the other end, the sound bright and relieved. "I told you it would work out. You just needed to be decisive." Gus smiled. "Always am." Bridget was already waiting for him at the hotel, and later that night, coordinating a small strategic appearance. Nothing public yet, just enough to plant the idea. A new start, a new image, a woman who fit beside him instead of lagging behind. As he stepped into the elevator, Gus allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The narrative was his to control now. He was the CEO who made tough decisions, the man who didn't let personal weakness interfere with professional growth. No one would ask where Lena had gone. By morning, he sat at the head of a glass table, overlooking the Sydney CBD, his fingers idly circling a Mont Blanc pen as he spoke to potential investors. He talked numbers, growth, expansion, confidence radiated from him. "This company is entering its strongest phase," Gus said smoothly. "No distractions, no instability." The men across from him nodded, impressed. Then his assistant walked into the room and leaned in close. "Sir," she whispered, "there's an issue with one of the funding channels." Gus frowned. "Which one?" "The Parker Heritage Trust." "The name barely registered. We don't work with them." "Not directly," she said carefully, "but their capital influences 2 of our secondary partners. They've paused pending review." Gus's jaw tightened. "I'll handle it." The meeting resumed, but something had shifted. For the first time that day, Gus felt a faint prickle of unease. He pushed it away. He had lawyers, consultants, influence. It was nothing. Outside, his phone vibrated again. Unknown number. He ignored it. In a quiet hospital room across the city, Lena Parker stared at the ceiling, unaware her name had just surfaced in rooms. Gus believed she'd never enter, and as Gus stood to greet investors, confident he'd cleanly cut ties with the past, the message he ignored waited patiently on his screen. Because the system he trusted was already turning against him, and the woman he'd discarded had become the silent variable he could no longer control. The transfer happened without ceremony. Lena Parker woke from a shallow sleep to the sound of wheels rolling and voices she didn't recognize. Her medical chart was removed from the foot of her bed. The IV pole rattled as it was disconnected and reconnected. No one explained anything until she asked, her voice thin and shaky. "Where are you taking me?" A nurse looked away. "Admin orders." She was moved from the private recovery suite Gus had insisted on booking months earlier to a general postnatal ward on the other side of the hospital. The lighting was harsher, the walls bare, the room smelled faintly of bleach instead of lavender sanitizer. Her new bed creaked when she shifted, and the blanket was so thin she felt the cold right through it. Lena stared at the ceiling, trying to grasp how quickly things had changed. An hour later, a billing coordinator appeared, with a practiced smile and a clipboard full of numbers. "We just need to go over your cover," she said brightly. Lena swallowed hard. "My husband Sue." The woman's fingers paused for a split second. "Your ex-husband terminated authorization this morning." The words settled slowly, like dust after a collapse. "And what does that mean?" Lena asked. "It means," the coordinator replied, lowering her voice, "that the extended care in the NICU for your children will require alternative arrangements." Lena's heart hammered against her ribs. "They're premature. They need machines?" "Yes," the woman said gently, That's why we need confirmation of payment responsibility. Payment responsibility? Words that felt obscene when spoken about 3 babies fighting for breath. That afternoon, Lena was wheeled past the NICU again, this time intentionally. She begged the orderly to pause for a moment. He hesitated, then slowed his pace. She pressed her palm against the glass. 3 incubators, 3 lives. One of them stirred weakly, a tiny hand curling around nothing. "I'm here," Lena whispered, though they couldn't hear her. "I'm not leaving." Behind her, a voice cleared. "Miss Parker," a hospital administrator said in a dry tone. "We need to discuss discharge planning." "Discharge?" Lena turned, panic rising. "I can't be discharged. I can barely walk." "Medically," the woman replied. "You're stable enough to recover at home." "I don't have a home," Lena said. The administrator nodded once, as if that had already been noted. "You'll need to arrange temporary accommodation." The cruelty wasn't loud. It didn't shout or threaten. It moved through paperwork and policy, signatures and silence. By evening, Lena's meals were downgraded. Her pain medication was reduced. Visiting privileges were restricted due to capacity. In an empty room, she lay alone, listening to the distant cries of other newborns, wondering if her babies cried the same way. Across town, Gus Harrison signed the final insurance cancellation with the same efficiency he applied to quarterly reports. It wasn't personal, he told himself. It was necessary. Hospitals found solutions. People adapted. Back in her room, Lena stared at her phone, scrolling through unanswered messages she'd sent Gus hours earlier. None delivered, all blocked. Her hands trembled as she typed one last message she knew would never be read. "They need me, please." She didn't send it. Instead, she curled onto her side, protecting a body that had already given everything it had, and let the truth settle completely for the first time. Gus hadn't just left. He was actively ensuring she wouldn't survive without him. And as the lights went out, Lena closed her eyes. Eyes she didn't know were already watching this injustice closely. Somewhere else in the hospital, a single decision was made, one that would quietly unravel Gus's careful cruelty. The decision was made in a quiet office down the NICU corridor, far from the administrators and their clipboards. Dr. Natalie Reed stood with her arms crossed, staring at the medical chart glowing on her computer screen. 3 patient IDs, 3 premature babies, all born in extreme conditions, all needing advanced respiratory support, all suddenly flagged for financial review. She'd seen this before, not often, but enough to recognize when power stepped in where compassion should have been. Natalie took off her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. She'd been a neonatologist for over 20 years. She'd seen babies survive impossible odds and watched others leave because someone upstairs had decided their lives were too expensive. The system never called it cruelty. It called it policy. A junior nurse tapped lightly on the open door. "Dr. Reed, administration wants confirmation on the Parker triplets." Natalie looked up. "Confirmation of what? That we're prepared to reduce intervention if cover lapses?" the nurse said quietly, shame washing over her face. Natalie's jaw tightened. "No way." She stood up and walked briskly towards the NICU, her heels clicking with purpose. The room was dim, filled with the steady rhythm of machines, doing the work lungs too tiny couldn't do alone. She stopped at the first incubator, watching the baby's chest rise and fall with mechanical assistance. "They're stable," Natalie said aloud, more to herself than anyone else. "Fragile, but stable." She opened the mother's chart. Lena Parker, 31, emergency C-section, severe blood loss, no family listed, divorced hours after surgery. Natalie's eyes narrowed. She returned to her office and opened a secure file folder she hadn't touched in years. Inside were copies of incident reports, sworn affidavits, and legal guidance she'd kept after a similar case had almost destroyed a young mother's life a decade earlier. She picked up the phone and dialed a number from memory. Edward Cooper, a barrister, answered after 2 rings. "It's Natalie Reed," she said. "I need legal advice, not for the hospital, for a patient." There was a pause. "That's a rare call," Edward replied. "What's going on?" Natalie explained everything: the divorce, the insurance cancellation, the attempt to leverage medical decisions based on money. When she finished, the line was silent for a long moment. "Do you know who Lena Parker is?" Edward finally asked. "No," Natalie said honestly. "I just know she's being crushed." Edward exhaled slowly. "Then listen carefully. Don't let those babies be moved. Document everything, every conversation, every request, every signature." Natalie's pulse quickened. "Why?" "Because," he said, his voice low, "this isn't just a custody dispute. That name is connected to a trust that hasn't surfaced in over a decade. Natalie closed her eyes briefly. She'd trusted her gut, and it hadn't betrayed her. She returned to the NICU and spoke to her team with quiet authority. No changes to treatment plans without my approval. If anyone pushes you, send them to me. That afternoon, Natalie visited Lena's room personally. Lena looked small in the hospital bed, her eyes hollow with exhaustion and fear. "I'm Dr. Reed," Natalie said gently. "I oversee the NICU." Lena struggled to sit up. "My babies are alive," Natalie said firmly. "And they're going to stay that way." Tears streamed down Lena's cheeks. "They're trying to take them from me." Natalie took her hand, not without a fight. As she left the room, she sent one last email marked confidential, attaching all the documented irregularities. Somewhere across the city, a long-dormant legal mechanism began to stir. And for the first time since Gus Harrison signed those papers, the balance silently shifted. The knock came just after midnight, soft but deliberate, the kind that didn't belong to a nurse doing rounds. Lena Parker woke from a restless half-sleep, her body aching in places she didn't know could hurt. For a moment, she wondered if she'd imagined it. Then the knock came again. "Yes?" she whispered. The door opened slowly. A man in his early 40s stepped in, tall, sharply dressed, his jacket folded over one arm, as if he'd come straight from somewhere important. He didn't look like hospital staff. He looked like someone who lived in boardrooms and courtrooms. "My name is Edward Cooper," he said quietly. "I'm here because Dr. Natalie Reed asked me to come." Lena pushed herself up on the pillow, panic rising. "Is something wrong with my babies?" "No," Edward said quickly. "They're stable. This isn't about their condition. It's about your name." She frowned. "You already know my name?" "Yes," he replied, pulling a chair closer to the bed. "But I don't think you know what it means." Lena gave a bitter laugh. "It means I trusted the wrong man." Edward didn't smile. "It means Parker." The word hung in the air, strange and heavy. "My mother's maiden name," Lena said slowly. "Why?" Edward opened his brief and pulled out a single sealed envelope, thick and yellowed with age. "Because your grandmother, Eleonora Parker, built one of the most private investment trusts on the eastern seaboard, and you are listed as its sole surviving beneficiary." Lena stared, certain that exhaustion had finally pushed her into a hallucination. "That's not possible," she said. "My grandmother died years ago. If there was money, someone would have told me." "They tried," Edward said gently, "but the trust was locked in litigation, family disputes, challenges. It's been frozen for 12 years. Lena's chest tightened. "Then why now?" "Because of a clause," Edward replied. "One that's only activated upon the birth of legitimate heirs. Multiple heirs, to be exact." Her breath caught. "My children?" "Yes." The room suddenly felt too small. "So what does that mean?" Lena asked. "That I get access now?" Edward shook his head. "Not immediately. There's a mandatory review period, 90 days. Until then, the assets remain inaccessible." Hope surged, then dwindled. "So it doesn't help me now," she said quietly. "It helps more than you realize," Edward said. "Because from the moment that clause activated, you became legally protected." He leaned forward. "Your ex-husband's actions, cutting insurance, interfering with medical care, they're now documented as attempts to cause financial harm to a protected beneficiary." Lena's fingers trembled. "Gus didn't know any of this." "No," Edward said, "and that might be his biggest mistake." Tears slipped down Lena's cheeks. This time not from despair, but from something sharp and unfamiliar. Validation. Proof she wasn't wrong to feel erased. "And what happens now?" she asked. Edward closed his brief. "Now we wait. And we make sure you and your children survive long enough to receive what was always intended for you." He stood up, pausing at the door. "One more thing. From this moment on, everything Gus does will be watched." After he left, Lena lay back on the pillow, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. For the first time since she'd woken up alone, she didn't feel invisible, because somewhere beyond the hospital walls, a sleeping empire had just acknowledged its rightful heir. And it was only a matter of time before the man who'd discarded her realized who he'd truly divorced. The 90-day review period sounded reasonable on paper. In real life, it felt like a sentence. Lena Parker was discharged 2 days later, with a prescription she couldn't afford to fill and instructions that presumed she had a home, support, and rest waiting for her. None of it existed. She walked out of the hospital in a borrowed coat, her bag lighter than when she'd arrived months earlier. No babies in her arms, just paperwork. On the footpath, she hesitated before opening her phone. She had $47 in her account, enough for a ride share. She chose an app-based service over a taxi because it was cheaper, not because she knew where she was going. "Where to?" the driver asked. Lena swallowed hard. "Somewhere with long stay rates." "Near Marrickville," she said. The driver dowhed without judgment and pulled into traffic. The temporary studio she found was on the edge of Marrickville, small and quiet, with a squeaky bed and a tiny kitchen that barely worked. It smelled faintly of old coffee and cleaning product. Lena didn't care. It was a place to lie down without being told she was costing someone money. Every morning she returned to the hospital by train, her body stiff with healing muscles and stitched skin. She stood outside the NICU glass for hours, memorizing every monitor number, every nurse's face. She learned the sound of each baby's breathing machine. One was stronger, one was slower, one scared her every time its alarm dropped. Still no permission to hold them. Soon, they kept saying, Gus Harrison never showed. On the 5th day, a letter arrived at the studio, officially forwarded by the hospital. Heavy. It stated her ex-husband had filed for emergency custody review, citing maternal instability and lack of financial capacity. Her hands shook as she read it twice, then a third time. That night, she called Edward Cooper. "He's trying to take my children," she said, her voice catching. "I know," Edward replied calmly. He filed the moment he realized the trust was involved. "So he knows now," Lena whispered. "He knows something," Edward corrected, "but not enough." The next week tested her in ways the surgery never had. Her pain worsened without medication. Sleep came in fragments. Some days, she skipped meals to save money for transport. She learned how cold Sydney could feel when you were invisible. Gus, meanwhile, told anyone who asked that Lena was unwell and refusing help. Bridget Newell appeared by his side at dinners and charity functions, her hand resting confidently on his arm. Photos surfaced online. Smiles, champagne, control. Lena saw one once by accident on a cracked phone screen while sitting alone on the train. She didn't cry. On the 12th day, one of the babies crashed. Lena was called from the hallway and watched doctors move with terrifying speed. She pressed her hands so hard her knuckles went white, whispering promises she didn't know how to keep. They stabilized the baby. Still, that night, Lena sat on the edge of the studio bed, staring at the wall, exhaustion pulling her down. 90 days felt impossible. Her phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. "Miss Parker, my name is Julian Cross. Edward Cooper suggested we speak. I believe I can help, but not in the way you expect." Lena stared at the screen, heart racing, because for the first time since everything had collapsed, someone wasn't offering sympathy. They were offering leverage. Lena Parker didn't reply to the message immediately. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, phone glowing in her hands, rereading the name Julian Cross. It meant nothing to her. Still, Edward Cooper wouldn't have suggested the contact lightly. Edward didn't waste favors, didn't introduce people without reason. She typed a single word back. "How?" The reply came almost instantly. "Meet me tomorrow in the city. I'll send the address." The next afternoon, Lena stood before an unassuming office building nestled between two glass towers near Hyde Park. No sign, no luxury logo, just clean lines and an understated reception. She adjusted the borrowed coat on her shoulders and walked in, her heart thumping harder with each step. Julian Cross stood as she entered the meeting room. He was a middle-aged man, calm, unflashy, dressed in a simple dark suit that wasn't trying to impress anyone. His eyes were observant, not curious, as if he'd already read her story and was now studying the footnotes. "Miss Parker," he said, extending a hand. "Thank you for coming." Lena shook it, then sat, folding her hands tightly in her lap. "You said you could help?" "Yes," Julian replied. "But first, I need you to understand something. I'm not here to save you." She nodded slowly. "Good. I don't need saving." A flicker of approval crossed his face. "I know. What I offer is structure, time, and silence." He slid a file across the table. Inside were organized, precise documents, provisions for temporary housing near the hospital, a modest stipend labeled as a consulting fee, no mention of charity, no hint of pity. "This keeps you afloat during the review period," Julian said. "It doesn't touch the trust, doesn't alert your ex-husband, and doesn't compromise your legal standing." Lena stared at the papers. "Why?" Julian leaned back. "Because I have a long-standing interest in the Parker assets, and because I don't like bullies who mistake patience for weakness." She swallowed hard. "Gus doesn't know you. He doesn't need to," Julian said. "Not yet." Lena hesitated, then asked the question that had burned since the hospital. "What happens if the review fails?" Julian's gaze didn't waver. "It won't fail, but even if it did, Gus would still lose." That caught her attention. "How?" "Because," Julian said calmly, He's already overplayed his hand. Custody threats, financial pressure, manipulation of the public narrative. Judges don't like patterns, especially when they're documented. Lena exhaled, something releasing in her chest. So what do you need from me? Nothing, Julian replied. Except one thing. Don't react. Let him think you're exhausted. Let him believe you're cornered. She gave a small, weary smile. I'm exhausted. Yes, Julian said gently. But you're not cornered anymore. Over the next 2 weeks, Lena's life quietly shifted. She moved into a small, furnished apartment 10 minutes from the hospital. She started eating full meals again. She was finally allowed to hold her babies skin to skin, whispering promises against their fragile warmth. Gus filed petitions, leaked concerns, waited for her to break. She didn't. Late one night, as Lena sat near the NICU, a baby's tiny fingers curled around hers for the first time. She felt then, not hope exactly, but certainty. The ground wasn't shifting beneath her anymore. And somewhere across the city, Gus Harrison mistook her silence for surrender, unaware that the most dangerous phase of the game had just begun. Gus Harrison noted the silence in the 3rd week. It wasn't dramatic. No angry messages, no emotional emails, no public accusations. Lena Parker had disappeared from his radar, so completely it unsettled him. At first, he'd taken it well. Silence meant compliance. It meant she was tired, overwhelmed, bending, as people like her always did. But silence, when it lasted too long, started to look like something else. Gus sat in his office, overlooking the Sydney CBD, idly scrolling his phone as a stock ticker crawled across the screen behind his desk. His assistant hovered nearby, tablet in hand. Still nothing from Miss Parker, she said carefully. Gus scoffed. Of course not. She's busy trying to survive. But he checked anyway. Hospital updates, court petitions, nothing new. Just the same slow grind, the same waiting period. 90 days, an eternity for someone used to immediate results. At a private dinner that evening, Bridget Newell leaned in close, her manicured hand resting on his arm. You've been distracted lately, she murmured. Is it about her, Gus? He stiffened. She's irrelevant. Bridget smiled, unconvinced. Then why does her name keep coming up in funding discussions? That caught him. What do you mean? I overheard someone at the gala, Bridget said casually. They mentioned the Parker Heritage Trust again, quietly, like a sleeping giant. Gus's jaw tightened. It's nothing. But when he got home, he poured himself a drink he didn't need and stared out at the city lights, discomfort crawling under his skin. He called his legal team the next morning. I want an update on Parker, he said. Everything. The report came back thin, too thin. No crashes, no emergency petitions, no records of financial despair, nothing that matched the picture he'd painted of her breakdown. Meanwhile, Lena's days settled into a steady rhythm Gus never imagined. She spent mornings in the NICU, afternoons resting, evenings reading legal documents. Edward sent her on a borrowed tablet, not reacting, not explaining, learning. Julian Cross contacted her only when necessary. Short calls, precise updates. Let him talk, he'd told her once. Every word he says without you reacting becomes evidence. And Gus talked. He filed a revised custody petition, more aggressive this time, citing emotional unavailability and unstable living conditions. He leaked concerns to a friendly journalist, careful not to name her directly. He wanted pressure. He wanted movement. What he got was nothing. No rebuttal, no interview, no breakdown. By the end of the 4th week, one of his secondary investors delayed a meeting, then another. Then a third requested clarification on exposure to personal litigation. Gus yelled at his assistant, blamed the timing, blamed the market. Later one night, alone in his office, he opened a private memo he shouldn't have seen yet. It referenced a pending capital shift linked to the activation of a legacy trust. His fingers froze over the keyboard. Parker. Across town, Lena held her tiniest baby to her chest, feeling the fragile rise and fall of a life she'd almost lost. For the first time, she wasn't afraid to wait because she understood something Gus didn't. Silence wasn't weakness. Silence was control. And as Gus Harrison finally started to feel the ground shift beneath him, he made the fatal mistake of pushing harder, unaware that every move he made was tightening the trap around his own future. Gus Harrison decided it was time to be seen. The silence had lasted too long, and in Gus's world, visibility was power. If investors were hesitating, if whispers were circulating, then the solution was simple: appear unbothered, appear victorious, control the narrative before it controlled him. The charity gala at the Langham was perfect. Crystal chandeliers, black tie attire, Sydney's financial elite gathered under gilded ceilings, sipping champagne and pretending not to watch each other closely. Gus arrived precisely on time, Bridget Newell at his side, her hand resting possessively on his arm as cameras clicked. She wore an elegant ivory gown, expensive, deliberate. He wore confidence like a tailored suit. "Smile," Bridget murmured. "They're watching." Gus smiled, greeted, laughed with ease. He spoke of growth and innovation. He spoke of stability, of focus, of a future free from distractions. When asked about his personal life, he offered a rehearsed answer. "Sometimes," he said lightly, "you make difficult decisions to protect what you're building." The phrase landed exactly as intended. Nods, understanding, approval. Across the room, investors whispered not about Lena, but about Gus's composure, his strength, his decisiveness. The man seemed untouchable. Gus felt the euphoria settle in his bones. This was his element. Here, he won. Bridget leaned in closer as they paused near the balcony, overlooking Circular Quay. "See?" she whispered. "They're on your side." Gus nodded, sweeping the room with his gaze. Then his eyes snagged on something unexpected. Edward Cooper was by the bar. Gus stiffened for a moment before smoothing his expression. Edward wasn't someone you ignored, but he also wasn't someone you publicly challenged. The man didn't belong to any firm. He belonged to results. Their eyes met briefly. Edward gave a polite nod. Nothing more. Gus exhaled, telling himself it meant nothing. He was mid-conversation with a fund partner when his phone vibrated in his pocket. He ignored it. Then it vibrated again. And again. Annoyed, Gus excused himself and stepped away into a quieter hallway, checking the screen. A message from his CFO. "We have a problem." Gus frowned and typed back quickly. "Be specific." The reply took longer this time. "One of our anchor investors has paused. They cited alignment concerns linked to a legacy trust." Gus's stomach clenched. "Which trust?" 3 dots appeared, disappeared, then the reply. "Parker Heritage." The hallway suddenly felt too hot. Gus typed furiously. "That wasn't finalized. It's inactive." "That's what we thought," the CFO replied, "but legal disagrees." Gus shoved his phone into his pocket and forced his shoulders straight. He'd signed hundreds of documents over the years. He didn't make mistakes like this. Back in the ballroom, he plastered on a rehearsed smile, laughter rising as if nothing had changed. But the music sounded sharper. The room felt smaller now. Across town, Lena Parker sat beside 3 little cots in the NICU, her fingers resting lightly against the glass. She didn't know about the gala, didn't need to, because while Gus Harrison was busy proving his strength to the world, the foundation beneath his image had begun to crack, and this time, no amount of confidence would hold it together. The headlines never came, and that, more than anything, unsettled Gus Harrison. In the days following the gala, his name still appeared in business columns, still associated with phrases like resilient leadership and strong public trust. But something subtle had shifted beneath the surface. Invitations tapered off. Calls were returned later than usual. Meetings that once confirmed weeks in advance were suddenly under review, and Lena Parker remained invisible. Gus sat in his office early one morning, his fingers drumming on the glass desk, as his assistant stood still on the other side. "I can't get a location update," she said carefully. "No recent hospital records. No new petitions. She hasn't responded to anything." Gus's lips tightened. "Is she hiding?" Or, his assistant said hesitantly, "She doesn't need to respond." Gus shot her a sharp look. She lowered her eyes. Across Sydney, speculation quietly bloomed. Not in tabloids, but in boardrooms, in closed-door conversations between people who knew how power really moved. The Parker Heritage Trust was being mentioned again, not loudly, but often enough to register. Who controlled it? Why now? Why her? Edward Cooper's name appeared in some discreet calendars. Julian Cross cancelled 2 appearances without explanation. A senior partner at a private equity firm quietly divested a smaller stake connected to Gus's expansion plan. None of it was catastrophic yet. Gus tried to regain control, the only way he knew how. By escalating pressure, his legal team filed for a formal psychiatric evaluation of Lena, citing postpartum trauma and emotional withdrawal. The language was polished, strategic, cruel in its restraint. He expected a reaction. He received silence. The court acknowledged receipt. Nothing more. That night, Gus poured himself a drink and stood alone in his penthouse, watching the city pulse below. Bridget was late again. He didn't care. His thoughts were fixed on one thing. She should be breaking by now. Meanwhile, Lena's days unfolded quietly, deliberately. The babies slowly gained weight. enough to draw cautious smiles from the nurses. She learned to hold them without fear, to read their breathing, to sit quietly for hours to the sound of machines beeping. Julian Cross visited once briefly. No flowers, no speeches. "You're doing well," he said simply. "I'm surviving," Lena replied. "For now, that's enough." She didn't ask about Gus. She didn't need to. Edward kept her informed with concise updates. "He's getting impatient," he told her over the phone. "Good. Why?" Lena asked. "Because impatience leads to mistakes." One afternoon, as Lena rocked her tiniest baby, a nurse mentioned something in passing. "There was a call from a journalist earlier," she said, "asking if you were still here." Lena's hand stilled. "What did you say?" "That we don't comment on patient status." Lena's heart quieted. Gus wanted the world to see her crumble. Instead, she disappeared completely. No photos, no statements, no spectacle. And in a city where power depended on visibility, her absence had begun to speak louder than any accusation. Because when a woman disappears without collapsing, people start to wonder, what does she know? Who's protecting her? What's coming next? Gus Harrison felt it in his bones now. The creeping awareness that he was no longer driving the story, he was reacting to it. And somewhere, in the depths of the financial machinery he trusted so completely, Lena Parker's name was being repositioned, not as a problem to be managed, but as a force no one could afford to underestimate. Gus Harrison finally decided to make contact. Not publicly, not through lawyers, personally. The message arrived late one night through channels he believed still belonged to him. "We need to talk, for the children. To put this to an end." Lena looked at the screen on the small kitchen table of the temporary apartment. One baby sleeping against her chest. The other two finally strong enough to spend the night in the NICU without hourly alarms. She didn't reply immediately. She forwarded the message to Edward Cooper. The response came minutes later. "Good. He's ready." The meeting was set for 3 days later. In a neutral space, Gus chose himself. A private boardroom in a city building he often used for negotiations. He wanted control. Familiar territory. Lena agreed without conditions. When she arrived, Gus was already there, standing by the window, phone in hand. He turned as she entered, his expression carefully calibrated. Concern, regret. Authority softened just enough to appear human. "Lena," he said quietly, "you look tired." She didn't respond to the remark. She sat on the opposite side of the table, hands folded, her posture composed yet subdued, exactly as Julian had advised. Gus exhaled as if the sight of her had confirmed something he'd already decided. "This doesn't have to be a war," he began. "We can sort this out before it harms the children." "The children are in hospital," Lena said calmly. "They don't know there's a war." Gus nodded, as if conceding a point. "That's why we need stability. Courts don't like uncertainty, and neither do investors." There it was, the truth slipping through the cracks. "I've spoken with my lawyers," he continued. "If you agree to the cooperative settlement, shared custody, controlled support, mutual non-disclosure, we can resolve everything quickly." He slid a brief across the table. Inside was a settlement proposal, generous on the surface. Monthly alimony, housing allowance, covered legal fees. In exchange, Lena would relinquish any claims to future assets, public statements, and any associated third-party interests. Gus watched her carefully as she read. Her hands didn't tremble. Her face didn't change. "This is more than I expected," she said softly. Gus relaxed. "Just a fraction. I want to be fair." She looked up. "Why now? Dragging this out doesn't help anyone," he replied smoothly. "And because I know you're struggling." The lie was clean, rehearsed. Lena lowered her eyes. "I don't want to fight," she said. "I'm so tired." Gus reached his hand across the table, placing it near hers without touching. "Then don't fight. Sign this. Let me take care of the rest." A pause stretched between them. Then Lena nodded. "I'll sign," she said. Gus masked his relief quickly, but it was there. He slid a pen towards her. A Mont Blanc, heavy and expensive. What he didn't notice was the second document beneath the settlement, almost identical in appearance, silently tucked into the pile. A perfectly legal addendum, activated only if triggered by a protected trust review. Edward Cooper had drafted it himself. Lena signed where Gus indicated, once, twice, initialed the margins. Gus signed last, barely glancing at the pages. He was already winning in his mind. When it was all done, he stood up and extended his hand. "This is the best outcome," he said. Lena shook his hand. "Thank you," she replied. As he walked out, Gus smiled to himself, certain he'd finally closed the chapter. He didn't know that by signing that settlement, he'd inadvertently acknowledged the trust he'd been trying to circumvent, handed over the leverage he didn't realize was keeping him afloat, because the paper he'd just signed wasn't a peace offering, it was consent, and the trap was now fully sprung. The first call came at 6:42 a.m. Gus Harrison was halfway through his morning workout, the Sydney skyline still washed in pale grey light, when his phone vibrated against the marble benchtop. He frowned at the caller ID. His CFO. Calling before markets opened was never a good sign. "What is it?" Gus asked, already annoyed. "We have a problem," the CFO said, his voice tight. 3 partners froze capital movement overnight. Gus grabbed a towel. "Temporarily? No, indefinitely. They cited clause alignment issues." Gus's jaw tightened. "Which clauses?" There was a pause on the line, too long. "The ones linked to the amended settlement you signed last week," the CFO said carefully. "The one that references protected beneficiary exposure." Gus felt a flash of irritation. "That was the standard clause. That's what we thought," the CFO replied. "But legal disagrees." Gus ended the call without responding. By 9 a.m., his inbox was full. Requests for clarification, postponed meetings, a calendar that once overflowed with certainty, now dotted with yellow alerts and tentative reschedules. Gus sat at his desk, a Mont Blanc pen twirling between his fingers, forcing calm. His assistant knocked and entered without waiting. "Legal wants to speak with you now." In the boardroom, 2 lawyers sat with open tablets, grim expressions. A third screen displayed a highlighted paragraph from the settlement Gus had signed with Lena. "This addendum," one lawyer began, "triggers disclosure obligations under exposure laws tied to protected trusts." Gus leaned forward. "What trust?" The room fell silent. "The Parker Heritage Trust," the lawyer said. "Your signature acknowledges awareness of its activation." Gus gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "That trust doesn't exist anymore." "It does," the lawyer replied. "And it's active." Gus went pale. "Since when?" "Since the birth of the triplets." The words hit him like a physical blow. "Are you saying," Gus said slowly, "that by signing that settlement, I confirmed knowledge of a trust I knew nothing about?" "Yes," the lawyer said. "Which means any actions taken before or after can be construed as financial coercion." Gus stood up abruptly. "That's absurd. She still doesn't have access to anything." "Access isn't the point," the second lawyer said. "Protection is." By midday, the ripple effect was spreading. A private equity firm requested revised disclosures. Another requested an internal audit. Gus's next funding round was quietly labeled, "Under reassessment." Gus locked himself in his office, hands braced on the desk, his breathing shallow. He replayed the meeting with Lena in his mind. Her tired voice, her downcast eyes, the way she'd agreed too easily. He'd underestimated her. Across town, Lena sat in a small meeting room with Edward Cooper and Julian Cross. No celebration, no smiles. "It's moving faster than we expected," Edward said, scrolling through updates. "His signature triggered more than we planned." Julian nodded. "He's exposed now, and he knows it." Lena looked down at her own hands. "What happens now?" Julian met her gaze. "Now," he panics. As if on cue, Lena's phone vibrated. Gus's name lit up the screen. She didn't answer it. Back in his office, Gus stared at the unanswered call, rage bubbling beneath a growing layer of fear. For the first time since he'd signed those divorce papers, he understood the truth. Lena Parker hadn't waited for mercy, she'd waited for him to sign his own confession. And as the market quietly began to turn its back on Gus Harrison, the empire he'd built on control started to crack, piece by piece, signature by signature. The boardroom on the 42nd floor overlooked the Sydney CBD like a glass throne. Gus Harrison had sat at that table dozens of times, always at the center, always in control. Today he stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, watching the traffic crawl below, as if the city itself had slowed to mock him. The emergency meeting had been called by his own board. That, in itself, told him how serious things had become. When he turned, the seats were filling quickly. Advisors, lawyers, 2 investors who had never attended internal meetings before. No one held eye contact for long. The air felt heavier than usual, thick with questions no one wanted to ask aloud. Then the door opened again. Gus expected another lawyer. Instead, Lena Parker walked in. The room stilled. She wore no power suit, nothing dramatic, just a quiet navy dress. Simple, contained. Her hair was neatly pulled back. Her posture was calm, unhurried. She didn't look fragile, didn't look defeated. She looked ready. Gus's breath caught before he could stop it. "What's she doing here?" he snapped. Julian Cross walked in behind her, closing the door. "She's here at my invitation," he said calmly, and with the board's consent. Murmurs rippled around the table. Lena met Gus's eyes for the first time in weeks. There was no anger in her expression, no triumph, just clarity. It unnerved him more than any rage ever could. She took a seat near the far end of the table, folding her hands the same way she had during their last encounter. "Familiar," a board member muttered. "Let's begin," the chairman said cautiously. "Mr. Harrison," the chairman began, "we've become aware of developments regarding your exposure to personal litigation and its potential impact on the company's valuation." Gus opened his mouth to reply, but Lena spoke first. "I won't take up too much of your time," she said, her voice steady, carrying easily across the room. "I'm not here to discuss our marriage. I'm here to clarify the risk." Several heads turned to her. "The Parker Heritage Trust has concluded its preliminary activation review," Lena continued. "While assets remain restricted, beneficiary protections are fully enforceable. Any entity financially entangled with actions deemed coercive or retaliatory is subject to secondary review." Gus felt the blood drain from his face. "This isn't," he began. Julian interjected. "It is, and the documentation has already been submitted." A screen lit up at the end of the room. Dates, records, correspondence. Gus recognized his own signatures, his own petitions, now reframed in a context he'd never considered. "This doesn't signify collapse," Lena said calmly. "It signifies accountability." The chairman cleared his throat. "Miss Parker, are you seeking damages?" Lena shook her head. "No." Gus looked at her sharply. "I'm seeking distance," she continued, "between my children and a pattern of behavior that puts image above life." Silence settled over the room. The board exchanged glances. Decisions were made without words. Gus's voice broke. "And you planned all this?" Lena met his gaze one last time. "No, Gus. I survived." She stood, nodding politely to the board. "That's all." As she walked out of the room, Julian followed. Behind them, the door closed softly. Gus stood alone at the head of the table, surrounded by people who no longer looked to him for answers. Because in one quiet appearance, Lena Parker had done what he never believed possible. She hadn't begged, she hadn't accused. She had simply re-entered his world and exposed him. The consequences didn't arrive with sirens or headlines. They arrived quietly, as true power shifts always do. By midday, Gus Harrison's calendar was empty. Meetings once marked as confirmed went gray. 2 calls from investors went straight to voicemail, not unanswered, but deliberately ignored. In the glass-walled corridor outside his office, conversations ceased when he passed. People who once laughed loudly at his jokes now looked away. At 1:17 p.m., the chairman requested his presence again. This time, Gus didn't stand by the window. He took his seat, fingers tightly interlocked on the table, jaw set in a practiced mask of control. Across from him sat the same faces, but their posture had shifted. They leaned back now, assessing, detached. "We've reviewed the risk assessment," the chairman began, "and the external pressure." Gus nodded once. "Temporary turbulence." An investor cleared his throat. "It's more than turbulence. 3 trusts have formally withdrawn." Gus's head snapped up. "Withdrawn, not divested," the investor clarified. Paused. "Pending outcome." Gus felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Outcome of what?" "Of your leadership," another voice said. The word landed heavily. The lawyer slid a document across the table. "Your actions, while not criminal, have exposed the company to reputational and regulatory vulnerability, particularly by virtue of the trust-related disclosures." Gus pushed the paper back. "This company is me." The chairman met his gaze steadily. "That used to be an asset." Silence filled the room, thick and unmistakable. "We are invoking the contingency clause," the chairman continued. "With immediate effect, the board will appoint an interim CEO while we re-evaluate governance." Gus gave a short, humorless laugh. "You're sidelining me for a personal matter?" "We are protecting the company," the chairman replied, "from instability." The irony burned. Across town, Lena Parker was in the NICU, one baby nestled against her chest, the other 2 sleeping peacefully nearby. Dr. Reed smiled softly as she adjusted a monitor. "They're doing very well," she said. Lena nodded, tears blurring her vision, not from fear this time, but from relief. Her phone vibrated. Unknown number. She didn't answer it. Back in the boardroom, Gus stood slowly, straightening his suit jacket. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. "She doesn't even have access to the trust yet." Julian Cross's words echoed in the room, through legal counsel. "Access isn't the point. Influence is." Gus's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, he had nothing left to argue. By late afternoon, the internal memo was released, carefully worded. Temporary leadership transition. Strategic realignment. The market reacted not with panic, but with caution. Shares dipped. Analysts hedged. Confidence waned. Gus returned to his penthouse alone. Bridget's things were gone. A single note on the benchtop read, "I need space." He stared at the horizon, an untouched glass of whiskey in his hand, realizing too late that everything he'd built depended on belief. And belief was fragile, because while Gus Harrison finally felt the weight of consequences settle, he still didn't understand the most devastating truth of all. This wasn't the end of his punishment. It was just the beginning. Bridget Newell realized the ground had shifted the moment her invitation stopped coming. At first, she told herself it was a slow week. Sydney moved in cycles. The gala season ebbed and flowed. But by the third unanswered text and the second cancelled lunch, denial became impossible. Her diary, once packed with rooftop cocktails, charity previews, and discreet dinners, was suddenly empty. She sat alone at a corner table in a Surrey Hills cafe, scrolling her phone, watching stories of women she used to stand beside. Same rooms, same chandeliers, same smiles, except she wasn't there. Her name had gone cold, and in her world, that was dangerous. 2 weeks ago, being Gus Harrison's partner had made doors open. Now it made them hesitate. Whispers followed her through rooms she was barely allowed into anymore. Not loud enough to confront, just sharp enough to wound. She chose the wrong side. She overplayed her hand. She thought it was permanent. Bridget's jaw set, refusing to give them the satisfaction. Did she still have Gus? She didn't. She went to his penthouse that night without calling first. Let herself in with the key he'd pressed into her palm like a promise. The apartment was dark, silent, too silent. Gus stood by the window, suit jacket discarded, tie loosened, staring out at the city as if it had personally betrayed him. "You should have told me," Bridget said, breaking the silence. Gus didn't turn. "Told you what? That things were falling apart," she shot back. "I'm being iced out everywhere." Gus finally looked at her, his eyes sharp and tired. "This isn't about you. It became about me the second your mess touched my reputation," she snapped back. He gave a soft laugh. "Your reputation?" Bridget's face flushed. "I stood by you." "No," Gus said coldly. "You stood by power, and now you're realizing it wasn't yours." The words cut deeper than she expected. The next morning, Bridget's agency called her in. The meeting lasted 12 minutes. They cited conflict of interest and image instability. Her contract wasn't terminated, but it wasn't renewed, their polite way of being erased. By afternoon, her phone rang again. Another client distancing themselves. Another opportunity on hold. Meanwhile, Lena Parker's name surfaced in conversations Bridget was no longer part of, not as gossip, but with gravity. People spoke carefully now, respectfully, as if correcting a mistake too late. Bridget tried one last move. She contacted a reporter she knew well, offering information on Gus's divorce. A subtle nudge, a chance to redirect blame. The article was never published. Instead, a quiet warning came via a mutual contact. "No one wants to touch that story. Not her, not now." That night, Bridget packed the things she'd left at Gus's penthouse. No confrontation, no tears, just efficiency. She left the key on the benchtop beside the same untouched whiskey glass Gus had been staring at for days. Across town, Lena sat in a softly lit apartment Julian had arranged, rocking one of her babies to sleep while the others rested nearby. She no longer knew Bridget's name. She didn't need to, because the woman who'd believed she was replacing a wife had just learned a brutal truth. You don't win by standing beside a man who burns bridges. You fall with him. And as Bridget Newell faded from the rooms she'd once craved, the consequences of Gus Harrison's choices continued to ripple out, reaching everyone who mistook proximity to power for protection. Gus Harrison stood outside the hospital for almost 10 minutes before going in. The building hadn't changed, but everything else had. The revolving doors no longer felt like an entrance he controlled. They felt like a threshold he didn't deserve to cross. He straightened his jacket anyway, habit overriding humility, and walked in. The receptionist looked up. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see Lena Parker," Gus said, lowering his voice as if that might soften the name. The woman checked her screen. "She's not listed under that surname." Gus swallowed hard. Then, "Lena." Another pause. "Room 612. Visiting hours end in 20 minutes. He nodded and walked away before she could see the flash of relief in his eyes. The corridor was quiet, too quiet. Each step echoed louder than it should. Gus stopped outside the door, his hand hovering, suddenly unsure what he'd say. Apologies were never his strong suit. Neither was admitting fault. But this wasn't a negotiation. He knew that now. When he knocked, the voice that answered was calm. "Come in." Lena was sitting by the window, one baby sleeping in her arms, the other two resting nearby in little cots. The city light washed over her softly. She looked tired, but steady, rooted in a way he'd never seen before. Gus closed the door behind him. "Are you well?" She didn't respond to the remark. "Why are you here?" Her directness caught him off guard. "I needed to see you," he said. "To talk." Lena adjusted the baby carefully before meeting his eyes. "You had plenty of chances to talk." He exhaled. "I didn't understand what was happening then." "No," she replied evenly. "You understood. You just didn't care." Gus winced. "That's not fair." She tilted her head slightly. "Isn't it?" Silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft hum of a monitor. Gus's confidence drained in that quietness. "I lost control of the company," he said finally. "The board moved me out. Investors pulled back. Everything's changed." Lena listened without expression. "I never wanted it to get this far," he added. "That's the problem," she said softly. "You never thought it would." "If we could," Gus took a step closer, lowering his voice. "We could still fix this. Together. For the children." The word hung in the air, heavy. Lena's gaze hardened, not with anger, but with resolve. "You don't get to use them now. They're my children," he insisted. "And you abandoned them before they could breathe on their own," she replied. Her voice didn't rise. "You didn't need to." Gus's shoulders slumped. "I made mistakes." "Yes," Lena said, "and mistakes have consequences." He looked around the room at the life he'd almost erased. "I don't want to be your enemy." "I don't need an enemy," Lena said. "I need distance." Gus opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing left to argue. No leverage, no authority, just regret, arriving too late to matter. "I'll respect whatever you decide," he said quietly. She nodded once. "You'll respect the court's decision." Gus turned towards the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. "You were stronger than I thought." Lena met his gaze one last time. "I didn't become strong. I remembered I already was." Gus left without another word. Lena looked down at the baby in her arms, breathing steadily alive. She pressed a kiss to its forehead, her heart calm for the first time in months, because the man who'd believed he could control her life had finally returned, only to discover she didn't need him for anything at all. The custody hearing was set for a Tuesday morning, early enough that the courthouse corridors still smelled of coffee and floor wax. Lena Parker arrived quietly, dressed simply, no fuss, no display. Julian Cross walked beside her, only as far as the security turnstile. After that, she walked in alone. She didn't need armor anymore. Gus Harrison was already seated when she entered the courtroom. He looked thinner than before, his confidence worn down until something fragile remained. His lawyer leaned close, whispering reassurances that sounded more like routine than conviction. When Lena took a seat across the aisle, Gus shot a glance at her, then quickly looked away. The judge entered, a woman with tired eyes and a voice sharpened by decades of family court. "Without wasting time, we are here to determine custody authority and parental responsibility regarding the Parker-Harrison children," she said. "Proceed." Gus's lawyer spoke first. He argued stability, resources, the usual points, cloaked in legal language. He referenced Lena's medical trauma, her temporary accommodation, her lack of independent income. He framed concern as responsibility. When it was Lena's turn, she stood without hesitation. "I'm not here to argue who has more money," she said. "I'm here to show who showed up." Her lawyer presented documentation, medical records, time-stamped visitation logs, statements from nurses and doctors. Natalie Reed's testimony followed. Measured, precise, devastating. "These babies survived because their mother was consistently present," Dr. Reed said. "When insurance lapsed, when support disappeared, when pressure was applied, she never left." Gus's lawyer objected. The judge overruled. Then came the financial evidence. Not the trust, not the assets, just the actions. Insurance cancellations, emergency petitions, the timing, the pattern. Gus shifted in his seat. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Harrison," she said, "do you deny terminating medical cover hours after your wife's surgery?" Gus hesitated. "I was acting on legal advice." "And do you deny," the judge continued, "that these actions coincided with ongoing negotiations affecting your corporate standing?" Silence. The ruling came swiftly. Primary physical and legal custody is granted to the mother. the judge said. Supervised visitation only, pending completion of parental responsibility counseling. Gus's shoulders slumped. Lena didn't react. She simply exhaled. Outside the courtroom, Gus stopped her. "This isn't fair," he said quietly. Lena turned, meeting his eyes without anger. "It's appropriate. You're cutting me out," he said. "No," she replied. "You walked away. I just closed the door." She walked past him, sunlight streaming through the tall windows ahead. Julian waited for her on the steps, reading her expression before she spoke. "It's done," Lena said. He nodded. "Good." That afternoon, Lena returned to the apartment, where 3 little cots awaited her. She moved slowly from one to the next, touching each tiny hand, anchoring herself to the reality she'd fought for. Her phone vibrated once, a notification from Edward. Custody order registered. Final. Lena smiled softly. For the first time, nothing hung over her anymore. No waiting, no fear, no leverage someone else could pull, because the law had spoken and it had chosen her. Gus Harrison lost the last thing he still believed he could control that day. Not his company, not his image, but the illusion that he could replace presence. The apartment felt different in the early morning light. Not bigger, not richer, just quieter in a way Lena had never experienced before. The kind of quiet that didn't signal danger or abandonment, but peace. Sunlight slipped through the curtains and landed softly on 3 little cots lined up against the wall, each holding a sleeping miracle she sometimes still couldn't believe was real. Lena Parker stood barefoot on the timber floor, a mug of coffee warming her hands. Real coffee this time, not something rushed from a hospital vending machine. She watched her children breathe, slow and steady, and felt a calm settle deep in her chest. 90 days had passed. The Parker Heritage Trust review concluded without ceremony. No announcement, no press, just a secure boardroom, a stack of documents, and Edward Cooper's steady voice confirming it had always been true. "The trust is fully accessible now," he told her. "You have complete authority." Lena had nodded, absorbing the words without celebration. The money had stopped feeling abstract the moment she'd lost everything. What mattered now was what it could protect. She didn't buy a mansion, didn't change her name. She did something quieter. She paid off the medical bills in full. Every nurse, every doctor, every night that had kept her children alive. She established a private medical fund for premature babies at the same hospital. Anonymous, no plaques, no announcements. Then she went home. Julian Cross visited one afternoon, not with documents, but with groceries tucked under his arm, like an ordinary man. He left them on the bench, rolled up his sleeves, and helped her assemble 3 impossibly tiny baby bottles while she laughed softly at the chaos. "You don't have to do this," she said. "I know," Julian replied. "That's why I want to." They moved carefully around each other at first. Respect before romance, trust before promises. Julian never asked for gratitude, never pushed. He just showed up, repeatedly. That mattered more than words. One evening, weeks later, they sat on her balcony after the babies had finally drifted off to sleep, Sydney sparkling in the distance. Julian turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "I don't want to be another man who walks into your life because you survived something," he said. "I want to be someone who stays because you chose me." Lena felt tears well up, unexpected and warm. "I'm not looking to be saved," she said. "I know," Julian smiled. "I'm asking to walk beside you." Across town, Gus Harrison watched a very different skyline from a much smaller office. The interim leadership had become permanent. His name was no longer synonymous with certainty, only with caution. He saw photos sometimes, never Lena's face, just glimpses of her life moving on without him. He never made contact again. Lena didn't think much about him anymore. One quiet Sunday afternoon, Julian knelt on the living room floor, 3 babies gurgling between them, and asked Lena a question without drama or spectacle. No audience, no ring yet, just truth. "Do you want to build a life with me?" he asked. Lena looked at her children, then at the man who had never tried to control her future. "Yes," she said simply, because in the end, she wasn't rewarded with revenge. She was rewarded with choice, security, love, and a future that belonged entirely to her. And as Lena Parker closed the door on the life that had once left her broken, she stepped fully into the one she had earned, strong, whole, and finally free. The wedding was small by Sydney standards, but perfect by Lena's. No press, no photographers hiding behind hedges, just a quiet garden overlooking the harbor. Late afternoon light filtered through tall trees, as if the world itself had decided to soften for a day. White chairs, simple flowers, 3 little cots placed carefully in the front row, guarded by people who had earned the right to be there. Lena Parker walked down the aisle slowly, not because she was nervous, but because she wanted to remember every step. The air smelled of fresh grass and spring water. Julian Cross waited for her, calm and steady, not performing confidence, not proving anything to anyone. When he took her hands, there was no speech about fate or predestination, just truth. "We chose each other," Julian said quietly, his voice carrying effortlessly. "Every day, especially the hard ones." Lena felt her eyes sting, but her gaze held firm. "It's all I ever wanted." They married before the sun dipped behind the harbor. Later, as guests lingered with soft laughter and clinking glasses, Lena slipped away for a moment, standing at the edge of the garden. She watched her children sleep, their chests rising and falling in the peaceful rhythm she'd once feared she'd never see. Julian joined her, sliding his hand into hers without a word. Across town, in a very different room, Gus Harrison watched the same sunset from behind a glass desk that no longer bore his name. The office was quiet, stripped of assistance and deference. His phone vibrated once with a news alert about a leadership award given to someone else. He didn't read it. Gus had tried to rebuild. New ventures, smaller deals. Nothing ever reached the heights he'd once commanded. Not because he lacked intelligence, but because trust, once publicly broken, never fully returned. He thought of Lena sometimes, not with anger anymore, but with something heavier, regret. He'd believed power protected him from consequences. That belief had cost him everything that mattered. Back in the garden, Lena raised a glass, not in triumph, but in gratitude. "To second chances," she said softly, "and the people who show up when it counts." There was no mention of Gus, no victory speech. He'd already been dealt with by time, by the law, and by his own choices. As evening settled, Lena carried one baby while Julian picked up another, their third carefully cradled by a close friend. The family moved together, imperfect and real, towards the life that awaited them beyond that day. Later that night, as the garden lay empty and the city lights twinkled in the distance, Lena stood at the window of her new home, the wedding band warm on her finger. She thought of the hospital corridor, where everything had been taken from her without consent. She smiled, not because she had won, but because she had survived, rebuilt, and chosen joy on her own terms. Gus Harrison would spend the rest of his life explaining what had happened. Lena Parker would spend hers living well, and that was the difference. Because in the end, the greatest justice wasn't the downfall of the man who had betrayed her. It was the full, peaceful life she built after him, surrounded by love, dignity, and everything he once believed she didn't deserve. And so the story came to an end. If you're still here with us now, truly here, then something in this journey has touched your heart in a quiet, yet real way. Perhaps it reminded you of a time when life felt unfair. Perhaps it mirrored a time when you were discarded, underestimated, or forced to start over with nothing but your own strength. Stories like this matter because they reflect a simple truth we often forget. We don't control what happens to us, but we always control how we respond. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus said, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." Lena didn't win because she destroyed someone else. She won because she chose dignity over bitterness, patience over chaos, and presence over power. Healing, as Marcus Aurelius wrote, begins when we accept reality without resentment and act with virtue. If this story resonated with you, take it as a gentle reminder. Your worth isn't decided by who walked away, who hurt you, or who doubted you. It's decided by how you rise, quietly and consistently.